You might OD a little bit on Sean this time around. Welcome back. Uh, as you can see, we're talking about color in a way that you probably will have seen me talk about before. So don't lose heart. Some of these are clarifying. Sometimes you'll have heard the other one, but you won't have, nothing will stuck to you. So hopefully some of that previous stuff is more like soil that's been turned over and now we're going to plant something in it. Maybe make it more permanent in your mind. That's sort of my thinking about digging in on one very little point. So Sean comes in. As I said, you're going to see a little more of Sean because he's going to come, maybe our guest next time. Sean comes in with this. He says, revisiting your essay, Direct Painting from Life, the Start or Lay-In, some thoughts come to mind. You mention attempt to hit the note on your actual palette. Apply that note to the canvas and then adjust on the canvas for first value, then hue, then intensity until you're in the ballpark. I recall this order, value, hue, intensity, coming up a few times and vaguely recall you mentioning you might have changed your position on this. Is it best to consistently address the notes in this order? I notice when I put a note up for the first time, I aim for a general sense of the value and hue. However, while visiting color notes for the second, third, fourth time, I always catch myself thinking intensity first. So Sean, thank you for reviewing that material and beginning to think it through. Let me answer the question. There's one of the things you need to know anytime you're talking about color is that if you don't understand that it's got three components, things you can manage to make the color more true, you're not going to be very good at it. And I was that guy. I remember thinking some days, why can I hit this like easy? And other days I can't. Until I did the bundle of sticks thing, which if you've heard the how do you break a bundle of sticks riddle, you know the answer is one stick at a time. So improving a note is nothing if not problem solving. Getting a note to be truly like, all of that relational stuff that begins to get you there is significant, but the relationships are all based on value, hue, and intensity of the color, and its relationship to the other colors in those categories. The element of those other colors is like them. So one of the things you can do, if you have three light notes, you can look at them and you'll notice one is more heavily the yellow, one's kind of the blue, and one's kind of the red. Because they're all lights and they're not all the same blue. Now, if they're all the same blue, it's another story. But I'm just saying that once you accept that the value problem is solved, now you can talk about the hue of that white, and all whites and blacks both have color, and you can talk then about also the intensity. So one of those three might be more intense than the other, and it's very easy to pursue these things once you understand those three components, and allow yourself the patience to pursue it. Sean's making another point that we're going to talk about in a different video, and he talks about having walkabout. He says he just keeps trying to get it, but he isn't using his awareness and his conscious mind. So you might call it sleeping at the switch. The Australian Aborigines walkabout was a phrase I like to use. I got a kick out of it when I first heard of it. The idea that a young man would disappear for 3 years, nobody would know where he went. They called it going walkabout, if I remember how the phrase goes. But you can't be out of it. You're going to be fully there all the time with your awareness and your thinking process. So when you're getting to colors, you have to know that the parts that you're thinking with. Should it be lighter or darker? Should it be more chromatic or less chromatic? And of course, remember, there's all this in relation to other things. Or should it be, and by the way, also in relation to nature, is your note not full of life enough compared to nature? You try to make it as like as you can, but in the process, you're going to find there are things you can't do. We paint the sun with the yolk of an egg. There are limits to what we're going to get. So we have to create the sensation and it's produced by the relationships. So you'll be talking about, should it be lighter or darker in relation to other things? And of course, even to nature. Should it be, and nature, of course, as I've said before, you talk about white on an object facing a window, you can't paint that white. It's not, your canvas is gray by comparison, right? It's two values over. So stop thinking you can actually match these things. Just get over it, okay? So what are you doing? You're saying, let this be my lightest light, let that be my darkest dark, and then you try to live in that range, and every note you hit is related to it, okay? That's so self-evident, right? But it's true of the reds. When you do the reds, one of them is going to have more yellow in it, and another one's going to have more saturation, and you know what I mean? So another one's going to have more blue, etc., right? And so your job is going to be, so the question now, okay, so I said that about hue, and about intensity and about values. Okay, those are the components of a color note. Uh, Bob Hunter talks about that, I believe, very, very, very thoughtfully in one of his videos that's out there. Maybe one from the Guild. But yeah, and I remember having having gone through the entire Art Students League world and not having come to that conclusion. That came after I was beginning to learn to think in my 20s, beginning to actually use my mind in a way, a problem-solving way, and being systematic and organizationally and all this sort of stuff, So it is a thing. If you're a very young person listening to me, I don't know that there's any limit to when that can start happening with you. I just hear things like it's frequently with men. It's in their 20s that they begin to think. Women apparently earlier they're using thought processes. And I know that when I used to hang around, work with junior high kids, I would find that between the grades 6 and 8, which would be, what would that be? Say maybe 12 and 13, 14, somewhere in that range. The kids would go from being bouncing off the wall kids who sometimes had an interesting question to being kids who were thinking things through. They began to be, what would you call that kind of awareness? But they began to be different minds. That's what you want to, at some point, that's just being an adult, just being able to think things through. Anyway, so I don't want to get into that excessively, but I just want to talk about, so Sean says, I mentioned this whole thing. I recall you said there's an order: values, hues, and intensity. Well, I did find that the thing was holding me back the most was values. If I got my values wrong, I couldn't get the color. But if you can't see the color, meaning you don't have the intensity, if you don't have it rich enough so that it projects as much as nature does, it's harder to see the color too. So ultimately, Sean, the real answer to that question is I decided that in terms of the tendency to be sort of more right was to be more right about the hue. Nobody picks up blue when they're looking at red. So you put a red down, and then you have this whole adventure. But is it a darker red? Is it a richer red? And then you have another question, which is, it should be more red, yellow, or blue as a red. But I wouldn't tell you there's an automatic to that. I just found what I needed to do. What I was furthest back on was realizing how important the value of the color was. And then this other thing came in. I just realized I wasn't using adequately, and that was the intensity. And I'm saying using, I just mean being really there analytically, comparing. And that component would be just, you can just think, you can just look back and forth and see if it's like that. But the truth is, back and forth doesn't get it because you can't hit a lot of the notes in nature. So it's always about back and forth within the field. So the most chromatic note over here you can't hit. So you make this note and that becomes, and then the whole set of relationships, that maintains right through the whole thing. It's a version of transposing. If you're in music, you might know what I mean. So, Sean, that's the best way to put it. Let's see. I noticed when I put a note up for the first time, I aim for a general sense of the value and hue. I think that's what most people do. They try to get it to just sort of look right. And but if you're not in the game and saying how dark is it and compare lightest light to darkest dark and figure out where it lands, some colors are much harder to understand the value of. Red is one of those. It's hard to. It takes a while to sort of sort out to get the right value, especially a highly chromatic one. One of the things about chroma is that it projects light. And so you think if it's bright, then you start automatically working with white. These are things you'll get over, but because of, you'll have failures. But so there might be a reason like that, that you can't see the values. But one of the reasons you blur down, though, is because it kills a lot of that color quality, right? It starts knocking that question out of it and reduces everything down to the projectiveness of light, which is what we call the visual order, the strong lights coming to your eye, and other areas staying back, meaning that their value relationships in those areas are more muted. So if somebody was actually asking me what's most important, I don't know if I could tell you, except in the sense of, if you're trying to paint light, we depend on value contrast to produce light. But then secondly, we also depend on intensity to produce light. So as somebody would say, if there was no darkness, you wouldn't understand light. It's kind of it turns into a good and evil metaphor or something like that. Somehow or other, how can you appreciate beauty if you don't see things that actually make you you gag. You know what I'm saying? And I don't mean it quite as bad as that sounds, but so that I think that largely covers it, Sean. And I just want to, let me just review it. I noticed when I put a color note up for the first time, I aim for the general sense of value in color. I think most people are trying to do that, but not systematically. And then, and by the way, that's one of the things I do when I'm putting up a color note, is I'm putting it up for its value. So when I say, what's the lightest light and the darkest dark, I'm not, if the red's the lightest light, I make sure it's red. And I make sure that the chroma is good too. But when I know I'm trying to get it right as the lightest light, I then compare it to all the other values in the room and make sure nobody gets lighter than that. And you'll find that there's a couple ways of looking at values. One is just notice who they're with mentally, meaning to say, if you see such and such a value on my shirt, say, and then all of a sudden you see it in my skin, you'd say that's of a piece, so it almost forms a flat. It's an area of value in a sense, even though it's broken, like it's woven into the whole picture. Same thing as colors, you know what I mean? But values are, so when you see a really dark, then you see it again and a third time, that begins to be so there's a way of looking at it. So you can see that, oh, those are all, as it were, of a piece. They're all the same value. And so that's a thing. But the other one is actually what it does in the ensemble. So if you have a picture where the lights are just dancing, you know it's a dark picture. If the lights are just screaming, and if the midtones are not talking very much. Now, if you have a midtone picture, you can have the lights popping and the darks doing a little less popping, or you can have the darks be the dominant in a midtone painting and the lights be lesser. And you just have to get used to those. But those are ways of looking at your values. And I'm just trying to get you all to be aware that you have these three sets, and there's so many things, so many ways you can analyze them by just observing them in a context. I think that's the best way to say it. But no, so I haven't changed my position on it in the sense of maybe it's order of importance, but I don't know that it's important to say that except for the purposes of light. It's more important to say they are triad. You can't get it without getting all of it, okay? But yeah, it's probable that, I don't think I've ever thought anything except if you don't get your lightest light and darkest dark, this game ain't happening, right? So that would put values way up there, and I think I've found that to be the case. But what's funny is that you're going to use blue where there's blue and there's red where there's red, and therefore isn't hue already out there somehow in your brain? But when you get to the hue part, you have to become systematic and say about a red, is it more yellow or is it more blue? When you're looking at a blue, you say, is it more red or is it more yellow? And all you have to use is the triad model of the Munzel wheel thing. That's all you need. You don't have to get complicated. And that's one of the things we can do. We can make yes or no questions, binary questions, as they say. But we can also make reasonable assessments of threes. But it's still it's tough to go much past that, except that you can also do it in the world of red, yellow, blue, and then the secondary grouping and see them as a set of two. Again, I don't want to make more of it than that. I'm sorry to get into an area that I'm not meaning to. But if we did nothing else but to tell you that there's three parts to color, they are the hue, the chroma, and the value. And you need to be good and true about all three of them all the time. And you need to correct your back straggler in whatever category it's in. I tell students when you're laying it in and you're covering a canvas, you can have a piece of drawing wrong, but I don't want you to work on it if your color is screwed up, because you're going to be drawing with your color in our model. So if your color relationships aren't singing, aren't making the color scheme, and aren't setting up, even before you start making any joints, as they discuss it with Sargent, putting value spots around and then bring them together to form drawing. Before it gets to that part where it becomes drawing, if you can see that the color isn't working, stay on it. And allow yourself, I give you another little heads up, and that is that when color's even slightly the problem, and you haven't been painting that day, say, it's a lot easier to go in and just adjust a color than it is to go in and feel aggressively. I don't know if anybody really wants to go in and start drawing when they're cold. So you get your brush moving. I think it's like a way of warming up. Is just check out your color scheme. Make sure you don't have something to deal with there. And I do this. I know that certain people around me from the big yellow background actually believe that you should look for the back straggler of the drawing first. I'm not that guy. I don't think you should. I think you should look for the back straggler first. But if you say the back straggler drawing and you don't have the color right, you're drawing with the wrong colors. Well, no, how is that a good thing? So I always go, when I go to the place where I'm going to make the dark meet the light to assess the value contrast in that spot, as soon as they meet, I say, how are your colors doing where they meet? Is that, because there's a thing that happens where two colors meet, where two values meet, because they both are two, it's also two colors. And that thing that's happening there is sort of like a finish or the rest of the tail, so to speak, of the, of the color discussion. So that's just a thing. These are things that the way I think about these things when you're in that world. And kind of like that's the world we just live in all the time. We always have to know whether we're dealing with a chroma color value, but we also have to know whether we're dealing with the color versus the drawing. And even in drawing, you ought to know whether you're talking about the proportions or the placement and various other things, or size relationships versus linear proportions, or angles versus proportions. So it's just about organizing your material and making sure you know what you're doing whenever you're doing anything. So you also, by the way, it's just so you can have the blessing of having accomplished the mission. Okay. Well, that's it for today. Did I forget to thank people today? I think I did. Where is that? I got to find my thank yous. Here we are. Benjamin C. Adam Choke. Oops, I got to see. Adam C. I know who you guys are, and you do too, of course. Stephen J. and Linda Jen. Again, these are all recurring, and you're keeping us alive, so to speak. Certainly keeping Mr. Producer happy by producing enough to sort of keep us, right there. We're not getting rich. I hope you are, if you need to. But I hope you're actually getting rich in your work, in the blessings that come from doing a good job and making beautiful product, shall we say. In any case, thank you, Benjamin C., Adam C., Stephen J., and Linda Jen. And I mentioned you last week too, so that's good. That's really nice. I wonder if you're doing more frequent recurring, or if I missed one calling your name out before. We have gotten behind. We're trying to catch up with naming all you guys. So, but many thanks, and I hope you have a great week. And I'll see you in the next one. All right, or you'll see me.